Well, it is amazing to be with you. I thank you for your attendance here today. You could be any number of places on this rainy afternoon, tucked away by a fire, reading a book, or slogging it out at work, or doing the grocery run, or whatever it is that women do all day long. So thank you for taking the time out of your day to be here and giving me the opportunity to talk about our experience with mental illness and how we think the faith community can play a vital and absolutely unique role caring for those who are affected. Our youngest son, Matthew David Warren, which means, Matthew means a gift of God, David means beloved. So our beloved gift of God was born on July 18th, 1985, and he died on April 5th, 2013. He was 27 years old. And for most of those 27 years, we walked with him through mental illness. He was an easy baby, and at about 1, he changed. His personality changed. He became very moody, very difficult, clingy, crying a lot, aggressive in preschool. I remember his first day of preschool and being terrified that when I picked him up that he was going to be the first child ever in the history of that preschool to be kicked out on the first day. I was just certain that was awaiting us. It didn't, but I wouldn't have been surprised. And increasingly difficult by the time he was 7. He was sad all the time, but we didn't know that children could have mental illness. We didn't know that children could suffer depression. So he suffered without any treatment for a while before he was finally diagnosed at 7 with clinical depression. And from there, it just felt like every year it moved to one other diagnosis. Then it was panic disorder. So by 8, he was severely depressed and having panic attacks. And then ADHD, and by 11, early onset bipolar disorder. And then by 12, suicidal ideation. And then OCD and major depressive disorder, and even up until a year and a half before he died, they were still putting diagnoses on him, and borderline personality was the last one. And as you can imagine, his life and our lives was just a mix of doctor visits, of treatments, of school modifications, appointments with doctors, specialists. We combed the internet, we read books, we talked to everybody we could think of. And as he grew older, those suicidal ideations turned into suicide attempts and then hospitalizations. And finally, tragically, he hit that unyielding wall of mental illness for the last time on April 5th, and he took his life. And in the aftermath of his death, the catastrophic shock and trauma and crushing grief, there have been moments in which I thought I couldn't take the next breath. There have been moments in which I have said, I am ruined forever. And even though we had lived with the threat of his death for over a decade, we never gave up hope. Truly, never gave up hope, never stopped believing that there would be the next doctor appointment or the next psychiatrist or the next medication or the next treatment or the next book, that somehow the next whatever was going to be the thing that changed it for Matthew and that enabled him to live a normal or more normal life. We just felt there was a breakthrough. And so when he died, we were beyond devastated and wondered if we could survive his loss. Soon after Matthew passed away, I ran across a quote. I have to tell you, if you've lost anyone, grief is a horrific thing when you lose anybody you love. If you lose a child, it adds another layer of grief to it. If you lose that child through suicide, it starts adding layers of grief that are like mattresses that keep piling on top of each other. And so we were looking for something at that point to get us through, and I ran across this quote. I've hung on to it every day since. It's from Eric Liddell, the 1924 Scottish Olympian, and he said this. The movie Chariots of Fire, everybody remember? Please nod and tell me you remember Chariots of Fire. It makes me feel so old when I say something and there's just a room full of people who just stare back at you. Chariots of Fire. Yes, we know Chariots of Fire. Okay, so the star of that show, Eric Liddell, the man that played Eric Liddell, said this. He said, circumstances may appear to wreck our lives and God's plans. But God is not helpless among the ruins. God's love is still working. He comes in and he takes the calamity and he uses it victoriously, working out his wonderful plan of love. That resonated in me when I first read it 2.5 years ago. It resonates with me every day. I live by that thought that God is not helpless among the ruins. If I had to give the reasons why we are surviving and even beginning to thrive again 2.5 years later, it would start with my strong faith. And I don't know how anybody gets through catastrophic loss, suicide, murder. I don't know how anybody gets through that without a deeply rooted faith, and not just in some nebulous force, but in God. I don't know how anybody survives without God. Before Matthew died, a friend gave me this marble box, and it has the word hope in it. She and I were in a little accessory store one day, home accessory store, and we were just cruising the aisles, and I saw that, and my eyes lit up, and I thought, oh, I need hope. But it cost a little more than I wanted to spend, so I put it back on the shelf, and a few months later, she surprised me with it. And I filled this hope box with verses that were giving me hope that Matthew was going to be okay, that God was going to heal him. And when I would ask people, I would meet people, and they'd say, we're praying for you, and we're praying for your family. And I'd say, well, would you ask God to show you a verse specifically about Matthew that we can hold on to? And people would send me verses. And I filled this hope box with those verses of what I felt that God was going to do. And I read through this box nearly every day for 2 years. It sat on my table where I have my morning quiet time or devotions with God. And I would open this hope box and I would pull out the verses. And in the middle of the night, when I was having a really rough time, worried, anxious for what might happen to my beautiful boy, because I just felt like this drumbeat of mental illness was getting louder and louder and louder. And I thought, I don't know that I'll be able to survive if something happens to him. And I would pull out this hope box and I would read over and over and over the verses that were giving me comfort and encouragement. And I also created a playlist on my phone, on my iPhone. It has the capacity to do a playlist. And so I called it Kay's Picks. And in that, I put probably 60 songs that gave me hope. Some of them were really quiet, gentle songs for those middle-of-the-night moments when I was overcome with anxiety and couldn't sleep. And I put some songs that were just kind of, power ballads that were great, that, middle-of-the-day songs. And then I put a few Brooklyn songs in there, Brooklyn Tabernacle songs. And they were like, yes! And it was like pounding, and they were like shouting to anybody watching that, I believe God, I have faith, God is going to heal my son. And those songs kept me steady. Between those verses in my hope box and the songs on my playlist, those were my weapons that I fought against mental illness. The belief that God was going to do something, he was going to heal my son, the songs that kept my faith strong and vibrant when I was weak and wobbly and anxious. And then April 5th, 2013 happened, and Matthew died. And that hope box, it felt like it mocked me. As it sat there on my devotional table, I had even read through those verses. The morning that Matthew, I was pretty certain that he had died. I don't need to tell you the circumstances. I couldn't confirm it yet, but I was pretty certain that he had already died. But I got up that morning and I read through those verses. And it was the last time I read through those verses, because those verses seemed to mock me. And this box seemed to mock me. Here I had gone out on this audacious limb, believing with everything I had that God was going to heal Matthew, or if he wasn't going to heal him outright, he was going to make it somehow that he could have a manageable life. This box mocked me. My playlist of songs that I had clung to seemed absolutely stupid and pointless. And I really thought that I might not ever recover. I wasn't even sure that I wanted to. But the alternative was to give up living, to stay in my bed, neglect my husband, my surviving children, my incredible grandchildren, and my work as an HIV and AIDS advocate. And then I read that Eric Liddell quote. And the truth of it was, yes, my life appeared ruined. Matthew's death had not only ruined his life, but it felt like it had ruined our lives. that our children were scarred forever, that our grandchildren were scarred, that our friends were scarred, that those who loved him, that everyone near us were scarred and ruined beyond repair. But that phrase, God is not helpless among the ruins, stirred me to hope again. Even though I could tell you truthfully that I actually have more hope today than I have ever had in my life, even though my son is in heaven and I will never see him again on this earth, I have more hope today than I've ever had before. But I have some unanswered questions, and I don't think they're ever going to be answered. And as I began to rebuild my hope, because my hope was crushed, and as I began to rebuild hope, because you cannot live without hope, and I repopulated my iPhone with songs that give me hope now, give me strength now. I put new verses. I thought I actually threw those verses that were in there, that were there the morning that Matthew died. I actually thought, my memory of it was, that I, about a month later, took the verses out of the box and threw them away. Not because God's word isn't true, but because those particular verses were not going to come true for my son, because he was gone. But a few months ago, I was digging through a box and I actually found those verses. So I still have them. But I've repopulated my hope box with verses that give me hope now. One of them is 1 Corinthians 15:43. And in 1 Corinthians 15:43, okay, this is going to sound weird, but I discovered in my son's death that I'm a cemetery person. Who knew? I had no idea I was a cemetery person. And some of you are like, oh, I don't think I should even laugh at that. It's okay. It's okay. You even have neighbors at the cemetery, which is interesting. You have to get along with your neighbors at the cemetery. It's really weird. But anyway, I discovered that I'm a cemetery person. And so when I go to the cemetery and I stand or I kneel or I lie down on or I collapse on, or whatever I do that particular day at Matthew's gravesite, this is what I say to him, 1 Corinthians 15:43. And I don't say it just to him, but I say it to all the spirits of the enemy that tried to crush us and thought that that was maybe the end of our lives and the end of our ministry and that somehow the enemy had destroyed Matthew for good. I say this, Matthew, your body was buried in brokenness, because this is what it says. Our bodies are buried in brokenness, but they are raised in glory. They are buried in weakness, but they will be raised in strength. That's the kind of hope that I cling to today. That is an absolute certain hope. Yes, Matthew's body was destroyed by his death. And you and I, when we die, whether we die of cancer or we die of an illness or we die in an accident or we die of old age peacefully in our beds, when we die, our bodies will be buried in weakness, but they will be raised in strength. And that's the hope that I hold on to. So as I've repopulated my hope box and I'm rebuilding my playlist of songs that give me hope to be able to cope with our loss, that didn't end the questions. It didn't end the mystery. It didn't end those unanswerable things that I don't know what to do with. Because in the face of broken hope, you and I have a couple of options. We can either say, you know what, God is a tease. God let me populate that box with verses and words of encouragement and that playlist with songs, but God is a tease and a fraud and a defrauder, and it's his fault. Another option is I can look at myself and say, if I had only had more faith, if I'd been a better mother, if I'd been a better Christian, if I'd memorized more verses, if I'd done this or I'd done that, or if I'd followed those instructions, if I had just been better at something, Matthew wouldn't have died. But what I have learned in these 2.5 years is that what I know about God precludes me from concluding that he is a tease and a fraud and a defrauder. And what I know about my own faith is that nobody could have had more faith than I did. Nobody. I was out as far on that limb of belief as I knew how to go. So if I'm not going to blame God, and I'm not going to blame myself, what am I left with? Because my son is dead. Well, what I'm left with is mystery. Big old fat mystery. And in your life, there are some things. It may not be suicide. It may not be mental illness. It may be something far less catastrophic than that. But somewhere in your life, if it hasn't already happened, it will. There will be that moment in which you go, I have no explanation for this. This doesn't make sense. This loss, this divorce, this child who's gone in a completely different direction when you know you've poured yourself out on behalf of that child, the marriage that ends, the health problems come, whatever it is, there will be some place in your life for which you have no answers. And you can't tie it all up with a pretty bow. I would love to be able to tie this up with a beautiful little bow on a nice, neat package, but I can't. And as you might tell, I'm pretty visual in my faith. I'm kinetic. I like things. I like to be able to touch and hold and things that do something for my faith. So I had the hope box and I had the playlist. And a friend heard me asking these questions of, why couldn't I save Matthew? Why that last night? I talked him off the ledge hundreds of other times. Why couldn't I do it that night? The time when he needed me the most, why weren't my words enough? Why wasn't my love enough? Where was God? Was God watching? Did God catch him? Did he think of us? And all the other questions that are really just between me and God. But I had to have somewhere to put them. And my friend heard me talking about that, and she bought this little Le Creuset. Some of you might be familiar with this line. This is not a product placement cookware. I don't sell these. But, it's this beautiful cast iron cookware that can take such incredible heat. And Le Creuset is actually French for the crucible. And she said, what you are walking through is the fire, and it is a fiery, fiery, fiery furnace. And your questions, you can put them in here because you are walking through the fire. And you can know that they are held here safely until you come face to face with Jesus. Because when you do, every one of those questions, you can even give him your little pot. Say, Jesus, I don't have answers for anything that's in this pot. I can't explain, but I know you can. To me, that is really the way that God begins to rebuild the ruins, how he begins to repair what is broken, is when our faith encompasses both hope and mystery. See, hope without mystery is really just untested optimism. Anybody can be optimistic. But really those who know that we have a God who is in control and who loves us can have hope. So hope has got to also be accompanied with mystery. And mystery without hope is bleak despair. But together, you and I can build a robust faith that can face even our darkest days so that God can begin to rebuild for us. In Ezekiel 36 and 37, God talks there about how he is a rebuilder, how the walls that have been torn down will be rebuilt, how he will repopulate again those fields that are bereft of animals, that those cities that have been emptied by desolation will be filled with people again. That's what I believe God is doing in our lives. That April 5th, 2013 was not the end of Matthew's story. And even though his body was ruined by death, he is still alive in God's presence. And his life has meaning. His story has meaning. And his story holds out hope for others who have been crushed by depression and mental illness. And you might say, how can someone who lost hope completely, whose hopes were crushed, and who took his life, how could his life give hope to somebody else? I don't know, but that's what's happening. I can't tell you the number of people who've told me, Matthew's story has caused me to hang on. Seeing what happened in Matthew's life, I can name on one hand at least 5 people who've told me, I've taken suicide off the table because I've seen the devastation that it has left your family in, and I can't do that. The people who've said, I'm going to keep fighting. I know Matthew hit that wall one too many times, but in his honor, I'm going to keep fighting my fight. I don't know how that happens. It's in that mystery. But so many people that I talk to every day, those who are in desperate trouble or those who love somebody who's in desperate trouble, you may be here today, you may be living with a mental illness, and I pray that this would be a place where you can, and if you've never said it before, that you don't have to whisper. As an advocate for people living with HIV and AIDS, I've gotten used to the fact that when I travel the world, and even here in the United States, I've gotten used to people whispering in my ear, I'm HIV positive, or I have AIDS, because the stigma is still huge. What I wasn't prepared for is I have now increased my advocacy to those living with mental illness and for suicide prevention. What I was not prepared for is now people come up to me and they whisper in my ear, I'm living with depression. I was just diagnosed with bipolar. I have borderline personality disorder. I have schizophrenia. Or my son, or my father died 27 years ago and we've never talked about it. These are the things that are whispered in my ears. And nobody should ever have to whisper anything about their lives, especially in the church, especially in the faith community. And so to get rid of that stigma. So whatever it is that you're living with, you may be, as I said, somebody who is here living with a mental illness, or somebody you love is living with a mental illness. And you may have felt at many points that your life has been ruined by the effects of mental illness, either to yourself or to someone you love. And each day may really, if we were honest, each day might be a struggle to survive. Man, you have got the smile pasted on your face. You know how to give the answer. When people say, how are you? You know how to go fine, or busy, or I'm okay. And you know how to fake everybody out. Because it's way too scary to think of talking about it. The stigma is huge. What will happen if you do? You don't want to be thought of as one of those people who's wandering homeless. That's what we think of with mental illness, is somebody wandering homeless down the street or somebody doing something tragic with a weapon. I mean, that's what we think of when we think of mental illness, which is just also not true, because the fact is 1 in 5 adults, that means a good portion of this room right now is living with a mental illness. That doesn't mean that you're crazy, which is what we think. It just means that there may be some of the stresses in your life have gotten to the place that it's affecting your work. It's affecting your relationships. You're not coping very well with the circumstances of your life. And that can be mental illness. It's not always at this huge spectrum. I think really what I want to say to you is that wherever you are, there may be a place of ruin in your life. And you may feel like your life has been wrecked and that the damage just feels incalculable. But God is not helpless among our ruins. God is not helpless among the ruins of our lives. God is not helpless in the face of my son's suicide. God is not helpless in the face of mental illness. And he is not helpless in the face of your ruins, whatever they may be. God's love is still working his plan of love, and he will use it victoriously. So I'm rebuilding hope, rebuilding my hope box, rebuilding my playlist, put different verses in there. And now it is my joy. It is a joy to be able to talk to groups like you, to be able to say, yes, mental illness is real. Mental illness is common, and mental illness is treatable. And we don't have to keep it secret, and we don't have to keep it quiet, and we don't have to whisper. In fact, whispering can lead it to be a lethal illness. Mental illness doesn't have to be a lethal illness. But when it's whispered, when it's quiet, when we don't talk about it, when it's hidden, and the place that we hide it the best is church. Let's stop that. Let's stop that. Wouldn't you love to bring your whole self to church? Wouldn't you love to bring your whole self, your body, your mind, your soul? Wouldn't you love it if there was some place in this world where you could go and you could say, instead of the stock, I'm fine, or I'm okay, or yeah, oh sure, yeah, great morning. Wouldn't you love to be able to say, you know, I'm actually struggling pretty hard right now. And to have somebody, instead of going, oh, well, I'll pray for you, and go the other direction, that there would be somebody who would lean in and say, tell me more. Tell me more. I care so much about you. Tell me more. We can do that for each other. I really believe that one of the things that we are most desperate for as human beings is that kind of connection, that kind of authenticity that says, here I am, I'm broken, but so are you, and that's okay. And when we can begin to do that in our churches, then we can make churches the place where not only the people who already are there find a true home, but people outside the church who think that we would be the last place they could ever go to talk about mental illness will find a home. I want to show you a very quick, about a 4-minute video. We did a conference at our church 3 weeks ago, the Gathering on Mental Illness in the Church. And these are some of our speakers as they talk about the value of the local church. And then I'm going to come back and give you a really quick acrostic on what every church can do about mental illness. So watch this.
When the church could not talk about mental illness, then it felt like God couldn't either.
It's as if psychology is of the devil.
I believe the faith community working together plays a unique role. The government and other programs, as good as they may be, cannot do.
I see the ways that the medical system can meet the needs of veterans, but I'm also aware of how much the medical system can never do because it doesn't have the ability to call veterans into lives of meaning and purpose and joy, but the church does.
So I went to medical school at a Christian university, and there was the tension between the Department of Psychiatry and the church. It confused me because your brain is an organ and can have problems just like your heart.
I grew up in the church, but I didn't hear these things addressed. And so I love the idea that we can be honest about the hard stuff.
If we didn't have hope when it came to breast cancer, if we didn't have hope when it came to HIV/AIDS, we would not be seeing the progress and the promise in healthcare that we see today. And I think when it comes to suicide and suicide prevention, we need that same hope.
There's so much hope in knowing that God has a plan, and that that plan is greater than any addiction that you might wrestle with.
The nature of these disorders is it affects people deep inside their souls.
There are many marginalized groups, but people who are suffering silently because of their mental illness and addictions, they need to have someone reach out to them.
1 in 5 children suffer from a mental health disorder during their lifetime. And it's so important to know and be aware of that as a parent, because what we also know is something like less than 1/3 of kids actually get treatment.
Mental illness is not a lifelong death sentence. Recovery is possible.
The only time we talk about mental health is when there is a terrible mass shooting and a terrible tragedy.
I think Christians underestimate what we can be to another person.
Psychiatry and the church should be working hand in hand. That's actually when it works most efficiently.
We're so used to wanting to do things alone and in our own strength and power, and it is very, very tough. Hold on and let people help you.
There are places of hope, and when you have hope, you can also bring yourself to bring healing.
We get to watch the light bulb go off where people realize they're not alone, they don't have to feel alone, that it is okay to be honest, that it is okay to ask for help.
These are not bad people who did bad things. These are folks who have a disease, and that we as a community really have an obligation to our most vulnerable citizens.
We have to train folks, our professions, our ministers, our pediatricians, our school teachers.
No matter where you are, reach out and look at the other people or the other organizations, churches, synagogues, doesn't matter, and get started.
The church needs to stand up. And now that we understand and debunk the myth of depression and suicide leading one inevitably to hell, of course, we're mature enough theologically and we understand it's not factual. Now it behooves us to stand up, to go beyond prayer.
This conference today about acceptance and connection and compassion, that is what's missing in the field.
One of the messages that a soldier needs to hear more than anything is in service of your country, whatever act you've had to do, whether it was right or wrong, God still loves you, no matter what.
The greatest lie of the enemy is that your brokenness will sever relationship. And I would say it's not your fault. It's not about your spiritual life. This is treatable. There is hope. And all you have to do is just take the first step.
So just in closing my time with you, I really want to try to convince you that it is the Church of Jesus Christ that has the greatest opportunity to make a difference in mental illness in the United States. There is a role for government. There's stuff that only government can do. The church can't pass laws that help people with mental illness. There is a role for government. There's financials. There's a role for private sector. There's a place for the medical community. But there is a place for the Church of Jesus Christ that is unique and absolutely vital, because it is the church that deals with the soul, that deals with the person. The government doesn't deal with you as a person. You're a citizen. You're a consumer of resources. The medical community doesn't always treat us as people. They treat us as patients or as numbers or an appointment at 11:15. But the church is the only place that is designed to treat persons as persons, to restore dignity, to treat us with humanity. Because let me tell you something, people living with mental illness are frequently dehumanized. They are treated not as human beings. They are treated as numbers. They are treated as less than. And it is the church that has a message of hope. And so if you've got notes or you want to just scribble it on your hand or, on your napkin or whatever, I just wanted to give you an acrostic based on the word church, because I believe there are things that every church can do. Now, if you know anything about Saddleback Church, where my husband is the pastor, it's a really big church. And so it would be tempting to say, well, of course that really big church can do something concrete for people living with mental illness. We're in a home fellowship of 15 people, there's nothing we can do. Or we're in a church of 200, or we're in a church of 500, and so what we can do is limited. And what I want to give you right now are things that don't require any money, they don't require any staff, and they don't require any training, which means they are within the reach of every single church, whether you're a home group or you're a middle-sized church or you're a big church. Everybody can do something that makes a difference for people living with mental illness. The first C is that you can make a decision to care for and support people living with mental illness. That may sound so duh and like, well, yeah, but no, you don't understand. So many churches don't care. They don't care about people living with mental illness. And so for your church, for your home fellowship, for your Bible study, to decide, no, we're going to intentionally be a group who cares about people living with mental illness, you will have already bridged the biggest gap. You will have bridged that compassion gap that says you are a person worthy of God's grace and His love and His mercy, and we as a fellowship, we as a church, we're going to intentionally and deliberately care for you. That can be as simple as in a prayer, a pastor, Bible study leader can stand up in front of a group and say, God, I pray for the people in this room right now. There's some people here who are barely holding on. There's some people living with depression. There's some people who have anxiety that's about to crush them. God, there's some people today that they think they're going crazy and they're terrified to tell anybody about it. And just by praying, did it cost anything to pray? No. Does it take any training to pray? Does it take staff to pray? No, this is within something that every single person and church can begin to intentionally, deliberately care. It just takes a decision of the mind to start caring for people living with mental illness. The first H is to help with practical needs. When I was diagnosed with breast cancer 12 years ago, I was inundated with people wanting to bring us meals. People offered to take me to my chemotherapy or my radiation. People offered to come clean our house. People offered to take my kids to school. I mean, we got flowers. I was just given so much with that diagnosis of breast cancer. But we call mental illness sometimes the no casserole disease, because I just feel pretty sure that if you were diagnosed last week with anxiety and you told somebody about it, I'm pretty sure that they didn't offer to fix you a meal or take you to see your counselor or to go with you to pick up your medication. I mean, somehow it's like if there's a mental illness, all the rules are off. All the rules of compassion. Suddenly it becomes shameful. It's secret. It was no shame for me to have breast cancer. It was an illness, and my congregation rallied. If you have a mental illness or someone you love has a mental illness, it's an illness. It's not a shameful illness. It's an illness. As Dr. Amen said in that video, the brain is an organ like every other organ in the body, and things can go wrong in your pancreas, things can go wrong in your liver, things can go wrong in your kidneys, things can go wrong in your heart, things can go wrong in your brain. And when we treat it and we understand that it is an illness, we're going to respond both with compassion and we're going to respond with practical need. We're going to help with practical needs. It doesn't cost anything to take a meal to a neighbor. It doesn't cost anything. It costs your time and it costs your self-centeredness, but it doesn't take training or staff or buku-doodles of programs. All it takes is somebody saying, you've got a need in your life? Man, I want to help. I'll help you. I'll be there for you. I'll do whatever you need. So care for and support. Help with practical needs. The U stands for utilize volunteers. In most organizations, NGOs or nonprofits or 501c3s or any type of program in the community, they're always looking for volunteers because they've got to have volunteers to make their program work. Well, the church is ready-made. It's got pews and padded chairs full of people sitting there, gifted, talented, creative, loving people who are looking for something meaningful to use their time and their talent on. And I can't think of anything more meaningful than helping people living with mental illness. So there is this ready-made little group in every church of people who are willing to be utilized if somebody will show them what to do, challenge them, give them a task, and they'll do it. Volunteers. The church has got them in spades. The R is to remove the stigma, and this is probably the most powerful tool that any church can do, and again, requires no money, no training, no staff to do this. What does it take for somebody to stand up or sit at a Bible study table? It doesn't have to be, most of you are not pastors in this room, but you might be a part of a Bible study. What happens if in your Bible study or your home fellowship, somebody says, I've been learning that mental illness is not about character, and it's not about weakness, and it's not about somebody being a bad person. I've understood maybe that mental illness is an illness, and that just amazes me. I just hadn't thought of it that way. By that simple statement, you are telling every other person in that circle that you are a safe person to talk to, that you are an educated person and an informed person, and that you're a compassionate person. And that in itself removes the stigma. If a pastor or a Bible study leader preaches a message on mental illness, oh my goodness, have you ever heard a message on mental illness in your church? Probably not. And I would have to say that we did not speak and preach about mental illness for many years for the same reasons you don't hear it, because of the stigma and because we kind of felt like, well, maybe that's not, even though our son lived with mental illness, we didn't feel free enough to talk about it. So to remove the stigma is powerful. I think that one of the things that we can do, because the church, when the church says you're okay, you're pretty much okay. The church is a legitimizing force in society. And when the church says you're okay, you're pretty much okay. And if the church says you're not okay, you're pretty much not okay. And there's been such a misunderstanding. I think one of the reasons churches don't do a whole lot about mental illness up to this point is probably one of two reasons. One, the misunderstanding about the nature of mental illness, that it's not an illness, that it's character, or that if you pray enough, or you have a demon, or if you memorize enough verses, or if you confess your sin, that somehow that's, if you love Jesus enough, I love that one. If you just love Jesus enough, you will be okay, and that you won't have this depression, and you won't feel anxious. And so a misunderstanding of what mental illness is and is not. And then I think, secondly, good-hearted people just simply don't know what to do. Where would they start? And so being able to knock down the stigma is a fabulous entry place for any church to be able to do something significant about mental illness. There is a young man in our church, and I'll do this quickly. There's a young man in our church who came to Saddleback after Matthew died. He's severely mentally ill. In his story, Matthew brought him to Saddleback. He never met Matthew, only heard of him after he died. So, you'd take that for what it's worth. But in his mind, when he heard that Matthew had died, he said to himself, that's a church I want to go to, because those people talk about mental illness. And so he believes Matthew brought him to Saddleback. And our church has done a lot for him in these last 2.5 years, helped him with counseling, gone with him to doctor visits, done all these things that we're trying to do. But on July 4th, it's 4th of July. Everybody's with their families. And it was a Saturday, and we have Saturday night services. And so I'd gone to church, and I saw this young man at church, and I gave him a big hug and, talked to him for a few minutes. And then I was off to my family's 4th of July party. We're going to watch fireworks. And as I was walking really fast out to my car, I just heard this sound behind me, and I just involuntarily kind of turned around and looked around. And he was standing in the middle of our patio at church alone, completely alone. Everybody else had gone. And he was standing there by himself. And I thought to myself, the thought crossed my mind, where's he going to go for July 4th? Who's going to invite him home or to the lake or to the picnic site? Who's going to take him with them and let him enjoy just a normal thing that everybody does on 4th of July? But you know what? I was in a really big hurry. I had to get to my family, and I got in my car and I drove away. But I have to tell you that every day since, I am haunted by the fact that what this young man, he had received practical help from us. He'd gotten counseling. He'd gotten meals. He had gotten hours and hours and hours of our staff time, of volunteer time. He had clothes. He had gotten all these things. But what he wanted more than anything else was just a friend. He just wanted to be normal. He just wanted somebody, as he stood there on that patio, to say, hey, why don't you come with me, our family? We're going to go to the lake. We're going to the park. We're going to my backyard, whatever. Why don't you come? Why don't you come be with us? I failed. I failed him. I left that man alone because I needed to get to my family. And when you and I can knock down the stigma, why did nobody invite him? Why was I wasn't the only one that failed. A lot of people at our church failed that day. But why did we all fail? Somewhere the stigma of bringing a severely mentally ill person into a situation that we weren't sure how it would work out. We weren't willing to risk it. We weren't willing to try it. We weren't willing to friend him. And what people living with mental illness need more than they need anything else is to be friended. And that means we have to get rid of stigma. Two other things in this acrostic. The second C is collaborate with the community, and that's exactly what you're doing right here. You are collaborating with community resources. The church has a role that nobody else can play. Nobody else can friend that guy. No government agency can friend him. The medical community is not going to friend him, but the church needs to friend him. So the church has a role to play that is unique. However, the church can't do it all. The church has to have the community resources. The church has to have resources like Summit Counseling Center. And so those who are wise are those who in the church recognize this is what we do well. We don't know how to do this, so would you come teach us? Would you come and teach us? Would you train our small group leaders? Would you train our Sunday school teachers? Would you talk to our children's Sunday school leaders about mental illness in children and how to recognize it? Would you hold a seminar for the parents in our church so that they can learn what's just normal stuff in kids and what actually might mean that there's signs of trouble and children need some extra help? So collaborate with the community. Those who are wise and humble will be willing to reach outside of themselves and pull in what they don't have, so that what we do better together. And then the last H is offer hope. And again, the church is the only place that can offer hope to this degree. Nobody else can offer hope. We have hope. This is our business, if you will. We have the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if Jesus Christ is raised from the dead, there's hope for Matthew is alive because of the resurrection. I will live again because of the resurrection. That's a certain hope. And when we offer people hope for their eternity, and we offer the hope that we're going to walk with them through their difficult days, through their severe mental illness, through their not so severe mental illness, that we're going to be there with people with compassion, without stigma, without judgment, with practical needs, we actually give people hope. And nobody can do that like the church. So my prayer for you as you listen to the rest of the things, their pickup brochures or pamphlets or books, as you listen and you think about this as you go home tonight, that you will take home not just the memory of a great lunch and some pretty things that you bought or some good books or nice conversations, but you will go home convinced. In fact, I pray that you won't sleep. I pray that instead in your heart there will be something that begins to burn that says, God, I don't know how you want to use me to help people who are living with mental illness, but I ask that you use me. I'm willing, I'm available. Would you use me in my church to be a catalyst for our church becoming a warm, welcoming, accepting place where people can bring their whole selves? And for those of you that are living with mental illness, I just want to know you are not alone, and you are not bad, and you are not weak. And I know that you have spent hour and hour and hour and many tears and much grief and much effort to find help for yourself, to find hope for yourself. And I want to reassure you, you are not alone, and you are so deeply and dearly loved. And those of you who, like me, have experienced some catastrophic loss, particularly due to mental illness, my heart is with you. When I speak and I talk to you, we just hold our eyes and we don't have to say things. Two mamas that I know right here. You don't have to say a whole lot. There's something in the hug that says, I know the hellish journey that you've been on, and I love you, and my heart is with you. So for those of you that I don't get to talk to personally, but you've walked down that road, please know that my heart is with you. God has not forgotten you. It's not the end of your story. It's not the end of your loved one's story. Together, we truly can bring hope for mental health. Thank you.